$44.8 billion. That's the total amount of public debt in Jordanian dinars owed by the Jordanian government as of February this year. In US dollars, that's more than $63 billion. It's not the $36 trillion like the figure blinking on the US debt clock, but for a country like Jordan, where debt makes up more than 92% of GDP, according to the International Monetary Fund, that number hits differently. Jordan is now at a crossroads. With US financial aid frozen under President Trump's second term,
when we have $36 trillion in debt, and we're taking care of countries that are very rich and sending aid to countries in some cases that are rich, in some cases they're not rich,
and pressure mounting from lenders like the IMF, Jordan is now forced to do more with less. And that's in a region plagued by conflict, inflation, and youth unemployment. Jordan's debt has been creeping upward for years, and now the country stands as a case study in how aid and borrowing can become lifelines, but also long-term liabilities. It lacks a thriving industrial base, it relies heavily on imports, and it doesn't have a strong supply of natural resources. For decades, aid, especially from the US, served as a financial safety net. All of that made the bulk of the problem with Jordan come from loans. It's acquired loans from international organizations like the IMF, which I mentioned earlier, which serve as a much-needed boost. But those loans come with conditions. Today, we're asking, how did Jordan get here, and how can it get out? I'm Salim As-Saeed, and from The National, this is Business Extra. Joining us now is Sarmad Khan, our company and markets editor, who's been studying a group of countries in the Middle East and their reliance on debt. So, we're talking about debt economies. For those who have never heard that term, can you explain what we're talking about here?
Okay, so debt economies is not as such an economic or a financial term. It generally refers to economies that have higher debt to GDP ratio. Higher is again relative. It really depends on your revenue base and your ability to service your debt commitments. If your revenue is higher enough and you are able to meet that debt commitment, then that's totally fine.
Tell us about the difference between foreign aid and loans. How does all of this factor into debt, and why is it such a unique problem in the Middle East?
So you look at the broader MENA region, there are two clear distinctive categories of economies: oil exporters and oil importers. For exporters, it is a tool. Debt for them is good because they don't have to dig deeper into their pockets, take on their own resources. Saudi Arabia, in that case, they have abundance of resources. They have a sovereign wealth fund, which has a very huge asset base. But instead of dipping down into their own pockets, they go to international debt markets, they go to bond markets, and they raise finances to fund their ambitious growth projects. So there it is used as a tool. But for oil importers, it has an existential dynamic. So debt and aid, in Jordan's case, is basically a budgetary feature in which they have to compensate for how much they are going to borrow, and what is going to be the level of aid that they are going to get will determine how they are going to manage their finances. If your indebtedness is creeping up and your economic growth is not matching that, then it becomes a problem for economists. It's a point of worry.
Why is aid so essential to vulnerable economies like Jordan's, and how do they get out of that cycle?
How do they get out of that is a $1 million question. And literally no one has an answer for that. But yeah, you go to World Banks of the world and the IMFs, and they will give you a roadmap. But is it going to work? Yes and no. You follow that in letter and spirit, it is going to work. But in Lebanon's case, in Jordan's case, in many other countries' case, it hasn't worked. So aid is what they need. Concessional loans, yes, they do need it, of course, to keep on fueling their economies. But what is a win-win situation for them? There's no win-win situation for them. You get a package, you get conditionalities with that. IMF and World Bank loans come with conditions that are more technocratic type of conditions. So they give you a target of how much your fiscal deficit should be, how much your subsidy level should be. In case of Jordan, they were asked to reduce their subsidies because subsidy is a big drain on their resources, their fiscal resource. That creates a rift for countries like Jordan, for Egypt. That there have been social unrest because wheat subsidies were withdrawn in Egypt and there was an issue, and then subsidies were withdrawn in Jordan and there were issues.
The crowds called on King Abdullah to sack his prime minister over the plan, which has IMF support but comes on the back of a sales tax hike and a cut in bread subsidies.
IMF and World Bank packages mostly come with very specific targets that you need to achieve. And once you start putting those conditionalities in effect, it creates a public backlash. It definitely creates a public backlash. Is there an easier way out for them? No, not really. So these are the economies where you will need a lot of foreign assistance as well as packages of concessional loans.
One solution, privatization.
So I manage this organization that is a membership-based network of donors, funders, and other kind of philanthropy actors working across the philanthropy sector.
This is Naila Farouqi. She's a New York-based philanthropist and the CEO of the Arab Foundation's Forum. She argues that a solid network of NGOs can sustain themselves and, in turn, sustain the economy of a country like Jordan. I spoke with her last month on the phone.
So one of the things that's interesting about the USAID crash is that as devastating, as horrific, as horrifying, as scary as it is and all of that, also brings to bear a very interesting opportunity that in the philanthropy sector is an opportunity that those of us in the sector have been looking for a very long time, which is to have that confrontation about exactly the kind of soft power that is wielded by philanthropic and development aid coming from the north to the global majority. There are several key trends, obviously, that happen across many different sectors. And in the philanthropy sector globally, several of the big trends that have been going on, and they're all related, have been around the decolonization of aid, the localization of aid, the shifting of power from global north to global majority, the reckoning around the definition and the embodiment of defining what it means to be an ally, what it means to empower, what it means to show solidarity. It forces regional global majority philanthropy to finally step up.
It sounds good in theory, but perhaps not as easy to put into practice.
So there are a variety of reasons on why Jordan is an important case in terms of foreign aid and fiscal policy and so on.
This is Laith Ajalouni. He's a Jordanian political economist. He knows all about the nitty-gritty of economic machinery that keeps a cycle like this alive.
Jordan is among the resource poorest countries in the region, even compared to oil importing countries like Egypt, for example. The way the Jordanian government was designed, the society was designed, the origins of Jordan government system and welfare system itself was built on some sort of a rentier model that was established along with the state building phase of the country. Since the 1970s, the US was a major supporter financially for the country and militarily.
You know, the United States is very proud of our partnership with Jordan. We are active in the South. We are changing people's lives in the South. We have health programs. We have work development programs.
And that kept going until the 1980s, where Jordan became even more reliant on foreign aid due to a couple of reasons that coincided together. Back then, Jordan did not have peace agreement with Israel, and the situation on the borders were tense. And Arab Gulf countries used to support Jordan for two main reasons. They were interested in the stability of Jordan, and they were interested in supporting the Palestinian cause and the resilience of countries who are on the front line with Israel. And back then, we all know that the Gulf countries it was like a golden era for the Gulf countries in terms of oil rents. So they were very generous with Jordan. So Jordan became even more reliant on foreign aid until the 1989, where Jordan had a fiscal crisis due to overspending and a monetary crisis also. And afterward, Jordan started to aim to become less reliant on foreign aid by reforming the economy and privatizing the economy, and that trend kept going until today. Jordan is still heavily reliant on foreign aid, especially after the shocks that the country got after the Arab Spring, whether when it comes to electricity prices, costs of energy, or the closure of borders of Iraq and Syria for a long time after the Arab Spring. All of these conditions combined, in addition to structural distortions in the Jordanian economy, how the labor market is designed, government spending, and other social and political issues, made Jordan heavily reliant on foreign aid.
What has the impact of this reliance been? So when we're talking about foreign aid, loans, putting Jordan at a point where it constantly owes and relies on this for its survival, how has that impacted its domestic and foreign policy?
So, Jordan's foreign policy has been guided by multiple issues, but foreign aid was one of the main drivers of how Jordan deal with different issues. So, for example, the relationship between Jordan and the US is one of the most important relationships, not only because Jordan is strategically important to the US, but also because the US is an important patron of Jordan.
I guess my question is, what has Jordan had to change in terms of its, even looking at domestic policy, for example, does it prioritize its own economic growth by being dependent on aid, for example, from the US or other partners? Or does it have to fulfill requirements of that aid as a priority over what's better for its own fiscal spending and similar?
No, Jordan allies were very flexible in dealing with Jordan in terms of how it manages its domestic economic policy and its development plans. The thing is, what Jordan used to provide in exchange is usually security related issues. Jordan played an important role in countering terrorism in the region and globally. Jordan played an important role in maintaining peace in the region by being the second country in the region to have a peace treaty with Israel. Jordan plays an important role in terms of humanitarian support to Gazans and the stability of the West Bank. Jordan plays an important role in promoting moderation globally. All of these issues helped Jordan to access more funds globally as an anchor of stability in the region. But when it comes to domestic policy, Jordan's partners, Jordan's donors, did not really intervene significantly in domestic policy. There were some reforms requested by organizations like the IMF or sometimes the US or the EU, but these reforms are usually agreed upon between the Jordanian government and these counterparts. They are not imposed on Jordan. And I think that's something that is to the benefit of Jordan. And Jordan has been prioritizing its economic growth since 1989 and when the reform started. And even after His Majesty King Abdullah reign started, he was prioritizing always economic growth through either privatization, through having more FTAs for Jordan with countries around the world that can boost Jordan's exports.
But can I ask what the result of that has been? Because Jordan still ranks relatively low among both global GDP comparisons and Middle East GDP comparisons. So has this drive for growth demonstrated well?
It did not demonstrate well. I think Jordan is performing much below its potential, but also that was due to some structural issues that remain unresolved until today. Also, Jordan is a net importer of energy. So these issues need structural reforms when it comes to transitioning to renewable energy and so on. But all of these reforms need upgrading the Jordanian electricity grid, will need massive investments that the government of Jordan doesn't have the finances for.
But that's the concern, I guess, because you mentioned all this investment is needed, but then, when aid comes in, it's usually to pay salaries, to just keep the country afloat. So you mentioned the debt, the amount that they have to pay back, when that becomes a priority, does it have a chance of surviving and getting the growth that it needs to develop its economy and companies and infrastructure to the point where it can develop these entities in these different sectors?
So there are three ways for a country like Jordan to secure the finances needed. That would be first either through foreign aid, second through debt, or through investments and public-private partnerships. So when it comes to debt, we are currently in an international debt environment where interest rates are high. The cost of financing will be high for the government of Jordan.
I think the biggest recent shock was that Trump froze all of aid to Jordan. Was that a wake-up call? And do you see it going in the right direction after that?
Yeah, of course, it's a wake-up call. The U.S. foreign assistance to Jordan is significant, especially when it comes to budget support. But when it comes to foreign aid, I think Jordan was trying to be on a path of becoming more self-reliant and less reliant on foreign aid since it started its reforms after the Arab Spring. So if we look at the Jordanian journey of fiscal reforms after the Arab Spring, and when we started again working with the IMF in 2013, if you look at the government budget, you will find local revenues are increasing, and the coverage of domestic revenues of current expenditure of the government is increasing.
Yeah, let me ask you this. I mean, do you think that these steps are enough so that if this type of hit comes again in a different way, that Jordan is on the path to self-reliance versus reliance on debt?
I don't see it enough. I don't see it enough because at the end of the day, even fiscal policy is part of a larger, more cohesive policy mix when you make an economic policy. The focus on fiscal policy and fiscal sustainability is good, but it's not enough to improve the country resilience. What you need to do to become less reliant on foreign aid is to boost your exports as a country. Because, for example, what I was worried about when the U.S. frozen its aid to Jordan was the current account deficit. Okay, I wasn't worried about fiscal policy as much as I worried about monetary policy, because Jordan suffers from a trade deficit, suffers from a current account deficit, and this 2 billion and losing around 2 billion US, 1.45, sometimes more, sometimes less, depends on the year, billion US dollars is massive for the current account of Jordan. And that issue will only be solved by boosting exports, whether that's tangible exports in terms of goods or service exports.
And you also mentioned as well that Jordan was resource poor, but then mentioning the minerals, the other resources that it does have that it can offer the world, just seems like it needs the policies and the infrastructure to be able to utilize that. And as you said, could be a place for data centers. If they can lower prices, these types of things, it has resources, but it doesn't have the means to utilize them, it seems.
Of course, and getting there is not difficult. Bottom line is business environment reforms, making the country more attractive to international investments by providing a long-term outlook on business environment reforms and remaining consistent in the policy rather than changing the policy.
It's a far cry from a perfect solution for a country like Jordan, whose population is getting rather impatient, desperate for jobs, seeking opportunities elsewhere. But there are options.
On a short-run outlook, as usually done in Jordan, it should be a long-term strategic outlook where the country can identify strategic sectors for investment and so on. And the potential is there.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Business Extra. This episode was produced by Yasmin Al-Taji, our editor is Duat Farid, our audio engineer is Arthur Edison, and I've been your host, Salim As-Saeed.